All right, and welcome back to Better Understanding the Bible. I'm your host, Dallas, and joined again by Mercy. Thank you for joining us, Mercy.
Hi, so good to be here again, Dallas.
Right on. Today, we're going to continue into these cool topics of origins. Today, what we're going to be doing is delving right into what is covenant creation. This is a term that's starting to pop up everywhere, and it's obviously something that I've been teaching about for quite some time, and we've never really got into what is it exactly. So, because this is out there, we need to define it. And the next coming up videos, we're gonna get into different discussions. I think be just in general very helpful for us not only to define this, but I think defining it might help answer some questions that we might have also. So, going to get into that. Mercy is going to jump in and share her experiences with it, as this is something that is for those serious Bible students. This seems to be very prevalent at this time. Some are saying this is God revealing this specifically to us. This is the next phase of awakening. So, whatever your perspective is, there's a lot of significance to this. So, that's why we're looking at it and hope you enjoy it.
Mm.
So, what is covenant creation? Quick, simple definition. What we're going to do, paralleling it, let's go look at the book of Revelation. And what we're talking about in Revelation is eschatology. We're all familiar, I think, in general with eschatology, and that's the study of the end times. When we take a look at it, there's a bunch of different views of the study of eschatology. There's futurism, there's partial preterism, covenant eschatology, Israel only, fulfilled preterism, a bunch of different names. And all those different names really are is different interpretations and views of eschatology, of the study of end times. So when we transition from that into the Genesis, what we're doing is the same idea, but when instead of studying eschatology, the study of the end, we're studying origins. So that's the study of the beginnings. Now, just like eschatology has a bunch of different views, so does origins. Origins has when we take a look at covenant creation, what we're doing is we're looking at one of the belief systems that you can use to interpret it. Just as when we look at eschatology, we can use preterism to determine how we read it. The number one origins view is physical creation, and we're all familiar with that. And that's what we're paralleling when we look at covenant creation. Is it's a view of how to interpret origins. Now, covenant creation, just like preterism, has a bunch of different views within itself. So, preterism has partial preterism, full preterism, covenant eschatology, IO, bunch of different views. And now, with origins, the view of we think a covenant is being created, that's what it's talking about, and not so much it's talking about physical creation. So, those who believe that just like in eschatology, futurism is talking about the future of Revelation coming to be, and preterism is the discussion of that covenant coming to an end. When we transition to origins, instead of thinking of Genesis telling us that the universe is being created, covenant creation is just saying, no, we think this is actually describing the covenant being created. So in Genesis, the covenant would be created, and in Revelation, the covenant would be ending. So that's what the beginning and ending from a covenant point of view would be. And that's what covenant creation is referring to. And within covenant creation, you can have many views. Like there's the Israel only view that believes the covenant it's referring to is the covenant of Israel. Then there's other views like creation beyond creation science covenant view, which is still a very Christian viewpoint put over top of the idea of the covenant being created. Then you get other views. Mine personal is Adam only, which then we're talking about the creation of the beginning of the Mesopotamian people and the Mesopotamian covenant. So when we look at what is covenant creation is a view of origins, just as physical universe is a view of origins. One us looking at Genesis going, no, we think that's actually talking about God creating a covenant with a covenant people. That makes more sense to us. So that's really all this is. I know I labored that a little bit, and I'm just trying to cover all the different angles. Revelation's talking about end times, Genesis talking about origins. Revelation has a bunch of different ways to looking at it. One of those views is preterism. Origins has a bunch of different ways of looking at it. One of those views is covenant creation. Just like preterism, there's a bunch of flavors you can look at it through. And just like covenant creation, there's a bunch of flavors you can look at it through. Just like covenant creation, I'll throw this one caveat in. There's still a lot of discussion about which view is the most accurate. And that's still, we're at the beginnings of this conversation of covenant creation, of which view is more accurate. So that's why here on this channel, we're really trying to push, let's have conversations. Let's get our views out here. Let's sit down and say, this is what this means, and this is why I think it means that, and can you show me why it doesn't? And let us figure this out together. So we have a great opportunity in covenant creation to come together and come up with some ideas in the same way that preterism started to grow. And so that's what we're here on this channel going through. And I hope now some of the, because there's a lot of stuff said about what covenant creation is, some of that may have been pushed off to the side because it's really not that hard of a concept to grasp. We're just thinking it's about the beginning of the covenant people and not the physical universe. So, Mercy, I'm going to, you obviously being here talking with us about the stuff, you have now sided with covenant creation being a foundational view, that you prefer to see the Bible through that lens. When you think of covenant creation, what was it that you would say moved you towards covenant creation? How do you see covenant creation? Maybe just a little history you had with it. Floor is yours.
Yeah, no, this is such an important topic, Dallas. I know that there's people out there, especially in the preterist world, where I was making a lot of, posts on Genesis and a lot of heckling and a lot of making fun of, like, who cares about Genesis? I don't know if you've had that kind of comment, be like, why are you talking about Genesis? Like, who cares? Like, that's a slam dunk. We already know what Genesis is.
Universe, man, God breathed,
Yeah,
they sinned, we get it.
yeah. What is there? We're trying to figure out the end of the world. Don't you know this is so important? Like, and people are not understanding because people are not really able to talk about it in the way that I think it should be talked about. So maybe if I can share a little bit of my background and story, we can make those connection points, right? So I'm in Bible school. Genesis is my favorite book and Revelation is my favorite book. I think that's very odd, but when I look at that, I'm a very like holistic, or like I see the forest. So I like to see the beginning and the end, and those are like the book ends of what our Christianity, what we say we believe in and base our authority on, which is the scriptures, 66 books. So I'm looking at Genesis and Revelation, and I decided, hey, I want to take a class in Genesis with our Hebrew professor, one of the most renowned professors in the Assemblies of God denomination. And there was only two Hebrew professors on campus because everybody was for the New Testament and everybody was going towards the Greek. And to me, I just felt like, how can you go there when you don't even know what the Old Testament is talking about? Really focusing on the ancient Near Eastern studies. That's really my love and my flavor for the biblical root basis. It goes beyond just Hebraic roots. It's the ancient Near Eastern culture. And because I have a lot of cultural anthropology, I had a lot of questions. So here I am in Genesis class, and I soon discovered through that whole semester that the professor didn't know. And it was very shocking to me because it's the beginning of our story, or the story of the Bible. And it was very shocking to me. I'm 19 years old and I'm like, what? And I remember specifically in class, I said, where is Genesis starting? I said, in here, it says, in the very, second chapter, where it is. It's in the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Gihon, the Pishon River. I said, this is Mesopotamia, correct? And he went on, and it was like, no one knows. And I was like, but when we read the Bible and it says here, Nineveh, or they went over here to Samaria, I said, we can actually pinpoint it and say where it is. So obviously here in Genesis, we're talking about a place, a setting, and it is Mesopotamia, correct? Well, we don't know. So I had this thinking in my head, and I'm like, this is very strange. And what he did was, it was very spiritualized, that is some kind of domain, some kind of mystical, like dimensional portal place. And then they fell, right? And then, here we are. And I'm like, yeah, but even after they fell, they're still in Mesopotamia, correct? There's Babylon, it's Iraq, it's right there where the cradle of life is. So I'm like, and I couldn't understand why he was not making those connections. So here I am in Bible school, and I'm like, gosh, if the Genesis account, and we're looking at doctrine, and people are believing in doctrine, they're not looking at the Bible. And this is where I saw the very disconnect. People think because, we know doctrine and Christian theology, that we know the Bible, but that's not true. Just because a person went through systematic theology 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, they think they know the Bible. No, you have to know the Bible for what the Bible is saying. And this is where I recognize that a lot of the professors, they didn't really understand what we would call today covenant language of the Bible, or biblical language. And what they were trying to do is, well, let's just study Hebrew. Let's get this one word connected, understand this word linguistically, syntax, how is it being used? But they didn't understand the culture behind it. And that disconnect is what I've been sort of pursuing in my Bible studies, to make those connections. So then when I heard of covenant creation, I was like, what is that term? What is that? They had a very hard time trying to explain what that was. And really, to me, it's the same coin. It's just Genesis is on the head, the Revelation is on the tail, and it's talking about, okay, how does this begin and how does it end? And because we have the same word, I finally clicked it together, where it's covenant creation is the same as covenant eschatology. So if at the end in Revelation, in full preterism, we believe that, hey, it was really the end of the covenant, the old covenant system and age, could it be, if we flip the coin, that in the beginning of Genesis, it's the same thing? It's the beginning of the old covenant system, not necessarily the beginning of the whole wide world and the physical creation and the whole universe. That's when I recognize, yes, this is where I need to be, because I see that in my studies and in my background, that, yes, that's a very important conversation, because that will lead us to what all the many other reasons why we're even studying the Bible, or believing the Bible, or believing in God. It's very critical to understand origins and Genesis.
Absolutely, very well said. Because when we're looking at it, if we're looking at Revelation, and everybody loves Revelation, it's so weighty. But what we don't really do is we don't put the respect to the fact that the only way you will ever understand anything that's taking place in Revelation is to know the rest of the Old Testament. There's no way to understand it, because it's all being taken as examples of things that happened in the Old Testament were being used to signify things that would be happening to them. So
And
when they're
checked here real quick that the book of Revelation has the most Old Testament references than any book in the Bible. People are really shocked about this, but people need to know that the book of Revelation has the most Old Testament scriptural verses, that is going all the way back to the Old Testament, going there in the book of Revelation. It's so key.
and when we take that look, even Revelation 22 takes us literally back to the garden in Genesis 1. And so the only way we're going to understand Revelation is by understanding what came before it. And that's, if we take a look at just any movie we love, like I'll pick on The Matrix because it's a big, long movie. And if you come in and you're familiar with the end, you might know everything there is to know about the end. But what do you really know if you don't know the beginning? You don't know what's ending. You don't know why it's ending. You don't know what's going to happen after it's ending, because if you don't know why it's ending, you don't know what contingency is going on. So, same thing when we look at Revelation. If you don't know why it's ending, if you don't know what's ending, if you don't know where it started, why it started, we're going to have to come up with a whole bunch of ideas. And so that's why this is very important. if the end is about the covenant ending, then the beginning is about the covenant beginning. In fact, we see that exact same language begin the New Testament because there's a new covenant beginning, and it's described as a new heaven and a new earth. Well, the old covenant began then with an old heaven and an old earth. And so it's not like we're taking big leaps here. And now this is where it becomes the covenant creation differences amongst the different beliefs. It's how are we going to interpret what's happening in one and what's happening in another? Because just like Revelation, this form of partial preterism reads Revelation 20 to 22 extremely different than Israel only would. Well, when we go all the way to the origins, say like a beyond creation science would be understood radically different than Israel only. And so that becomes, well, which view is right? So this is why covenant creation isn't a view. Covenant creation is a concept in which we can interpret origins through. Covenant creation is that's where the covenant began. But depending on how you see and what you see as that beginning to the covenant will radically change the ending. Because if you're Israel only, and you think that it's only talking about Israel versus, say, covenant creation, which tends to include all of humans in that interaction somehow, well, you're going to have radically different conclusions then as well. So this becomes very important. So just as even futurists argue amongst themselves about what is going to come, preterists argue amongst themselves what's going to come, just as physical creationists argue about how it came to be, covenant creationists argue about how it came to be as well. So that's where this conversation needs to start expanding. We need to start going across these borders, or we're just creating new denominations all over the place with one guy mean one thing and another guy means another, when we can simply sit down and discuss these things. But let's face it, even at the time of Corinthians, we're all dividing into our groups and we're all saying, well, we're right, we're the approved ones. So that's the situation we kind of find ourselves in. And so, I think this is a good opening, a good summary to what is covenant creation. It's a view of how we read the origins account. And as we read the origins account, depending on how we do, well, it's going to drastically, change what we see as the outcome. If I read origins as a physical creation, I'm going to read a Revelation as the end of physical creation. If I read origins as a covenant being created, I'm going to read Revelation as a covenant coming to an end. And so when we take a look at these things and you're deciding for yourself, where do you enter into this argument, conversation, however we want to describe it, of covenant creation? I'm going to throw this out there and say, and then Mercy, if you wouldn't mind commenting to him from your experiences, I find what covenant creation boils down to, if you're on forums, if you're trying to have engagement with people, is an argument about word usage, which unfortunately isn't covenant creation, but rather it's an argument between different views of covenant creation. And so what ends up happening is, and this is what we want to avoid, in my opinion, is there becomes a code book. So covenant creation isn't necessarily trying to understand the creation of covenant as much as it becomes a conversation. And this is where the confusion of new people to the topic, or people who've been in it for a while and maybe we haven't pushed the weight to it. But covenant creation has become a code book of this word means this word, or this word means this word. And we've lost context into a lot of these conversations. And like you had brought up in your opening, there is a context. There's a reason why this is being put together. And if we're just still at that state, like when preterism was first early, it was, well, this word obviously means this, and this word means that. And then we had some really bad interpretations of, well, then let's just plug it in, because it doesn't work that way. We have to read it in the context in which it's like, oh, so this word is used like this. Now, when we read it in this story, we can see how it's being used. However, that same word used in a different story might be used differently. Well, that's what we need to do with Genesis. We got to look at it with respect to the fact that these words aren't code words, but rather they're words used by people to draw a picture for us to gain an understanding. And we need to read it in there. And unfortunately, covenant creation has become more of a battle of what does this word mean versus what does this word mean. So that's a big differential, I think, when we take a look at what are the different views. So, like, if we look at Israel only, they're saying these words mean this. When we're looking at Beyond Creation Science, these words mean that. When we're looking at my view, I'm saying, well, I'm saying these words mean this. So that leaves us into a situation again where I'm going to push the coin forward. We need discussions about it, not arguments, not people saying who's right or who's wrong, but rather let's sit down and say, this is why I think about it. Why do you think about yours? Let's look at what's more reasonable and let's move forward into this because we have a great opportunity because we're at such a young time in this new topic. And it's a very important topic, like Mercy said. So, kind of keeping that in mind, we kind of develop creation really isn't just a thing. It's a view with a bunch of different views within it that are trying to figure this out. And we're now in a weird situation where I think the conversation is now the next growing point. So I'll throw over the question to you. Where do you see covenant creation right now? And in the midst of that, the confusion, which maybe you could speak to with maybe an idea or so about what we need to do, because most people hear covenant creation and we think it's one thing, and it's obvious it's not. So, what would you speak to that concern with?
Well, I have several things, Dallas, that I want to share here that goes along with what you are thinking, and that is, when when we're learning something new, we have new language that we start with. So this code word that you're talking about, or what does heaven mean here? What does falling, cast away mean here, and that kind of thing. I think that's a good beginning to start, like a child when they're learning different concepts. You start with these words because they don't see the big picture. But the way we're going about teaching it, let me say the approach, what I see is that it's an inductive or a deductive approach. And so some people are teaching it where we're just looking at one tree and we're trying to just focus on that one tree and the different parts of that tree. And other people are teaching it, well, let me show you the context or the big picture, the forest, and then we can finally realize where everything goes. So I see that different people are approaching it differently. I think because of the way they think. We normally teach the way we think. So people that are more inductive or deductive in their thinking are teaching it that way. Thus, their approach is very different. But let me scroll all the way back. Like, let me speak to, physical creation. If they understood the context of Genesis in the Mesopotamian era and the time of polytheism and what's happening in that time frame, okay, you would already know that there is no reason to use Genesis to prove that there is a God. Everybody believes in a God in Genesis. That's like a no-brainer. But if you don't know ancient Near Eastern culture and that setting and that context of Genesis, then you're just trying to use it in your modern day era of, hey, I'm going to use Genesis to see, it says there God created everything. So there has to be a God, right? Out of nothing, ex nihilo. And so therefore, and these people, they're trying to, prove a point when the point was already proven in Genesis. The audience and the authors already believed there was. So their point of writing it was never to prove God, never to prove that God created creation. See, this is what I'm saying. If people understood the context of the ancient Near Eastern culture, you wouldn't even bother to go along this kind of reasoning and this kind of argumentation and trying to put our modern version into a text that's very ancient, very old, and they're talking about something totally different because their cosmology there already is a God. In fact, there's many, many gods. But this is very special because it's talking about a covenantal God who is Yahweh. And we're being introduced to this covenant people. When you understand that in Genesis, it's very plain to see what is spinning in, the 50 chapters of Genesis. But we're not being taught that. People don't see the, inductive style or the whole forest of what we're talking about. And they're just looking at one little thing. Well, what's the tree? What was the tree of life? What was that? Or who was that? And we're asking like almost like baby talk just on one little word when that's not, I don't think that's very helpful in the approach. I think that it actually leads to variations and we get distracted into arguments that have nothing to do with what we're even talking about, and it sort of detracts from what we're trying to teach people. I think if we flip it the other way and show the context and the background of Genesis, then it naturally flows out of that. Oh yeah, okay, well, this term, that term in this context, and it flows better and it's more comprehensible.
Well, the audience relevancy is a very big argument proponent of covenant creation. Absolutely. If we take it out of that realm, that's the only way we can really start to insert all those other things. So that's one of those very, very important realizations that audience relevancy, and I like how you're pointing it out, isn't a code. We use similar language in different scenarios all the time, not to mention idioms, motifs, allegories. So we're constantly using this language flippantly. Like we just mix it in without even thinking about it. Went to the store the other day. It was raining cats and dogs. I got home and the weight of the world was on my shoulders because, my husband's being a dog. We don't hear how many weird things are in that sentence that if you weren't in our culture, you'd have no idea what's taking place.
You
So
know,
we kind of,
morning on Sunday teaching, I forgot the idiom and I said, "What is it with your teeth?" Like, "Oh, he made it through the skin of his teeth." And I was like,
by the skin.
I couldn't say it, and somebody in the, and she told me, no, it's the skin of my teeth, and I'm like, just think of that, like how weird is that idiom in itself? But I say it, and we all know what it means. But that's what they were doing too.
And to that point of audience relevancy, Mercy was at the mercy of all the people in her class that I just assume because that's how come I'm going to use it. We are 3,500 years removed from a people that didn't use our language, didn't use our characters of our language, didn't use numbers. So it was a very different way that they would express themselves. They didn't speak the same way we did. They didn't think the same way we did. No culture today reflects what they were even going through. We are completely removed. The only way we can determine any semblance of what they were thinking is to dig through their parchments and try to figure it out. Like Mercy's example, if you read enough books and came to enough scenarios where you found people saying by the skin of my teeth, we would become comfortable going, oh, do you see how they're using it? But wait a minute, he's used skin of his teeth for marriage. That's not a fit. Why would is he biting onto? Oh, so now this time he used it differently. Same expression. So, well, wait a minute. But over here, he said he made through the test by the skin of his teeth. What? Marriages are tests? So it's different context, even though this word usage, and that's why when we look at Genesis and we're taking a look at covenant creation, that is, and I agree with you, is probably one of the biggest problems, bar none, is how are we accumulating our data? How are we processing it to apply it to Genesis? And it's the exact same conversation with Revelation. And when we read Revelation 12 and we see, oh, she gave birth to a son who was given a rod of iron to rule the world. Well, I was like, that's Psalm 2. Is it or is it not? We have a reasons for and a reasons against. And so we're comparing and we're learning. But do we stop there? And that becomes part of the challenge. Do we find the answers we want or do we find the answers? And so this becomes a big battle. Are we remembering audience relevancy? Are we looking at enough examples? Are there enough examples to determine some word usages? Because sometimes we simply won't know some of their stuff because we just don't have enough examples of it. And we need to be willing to go into those tough places. And I think covenant creation in general focuses on word usage. And that's where a lot of the division comes in. The divisions of the views are not necessarily uh, big, enormous differences. But when you put the numbers into the calculator, they do spit out at the end a very different ending. So those word usages between Israel only versus like a beyond creation science versus my Adam only view, depending on how you start it, again brings us back to, well, that finish is going to be very different. If the divergence is only 2 points at Genesis, well, those two lines continuing on to separate, by the time we get to Revelation, it could be 30,000 point difference in trajectory of where that ends. So I think that's a very good point about audience relevancy. Was there other things did you want, because you said you had a bunch, so we got a little bit of time, so please feel free.
Um, well, we might differ in this area here. One of the things I love about what you do is that you're really focusing on the scriptures, and the scriptures having to interpret scripture, to discover and to excavate the actual word usage of heaven and earth, right? Sun, moon, and stars. These kinds of concepts, these kinds of metaphors, and an understanding of the Bible. And I think that is very critical, to let the Bible speak what it must. But I think there's a certain level, a point where if you actually tap into the cuneiform tablets, if you actually tap into other ancient Near Eastern texts, I know for some reason, a lot of Christians are freaked out by it. Only scripture. You can only use scripture. You can't go outside of this. Now, yes, if we are very close to that culture and to the time frame, but like you said, because we're so far removed, if you don't excavate the other texts that were written down at the very same time in the same location, and they're coming from the same culture and the same background, and you're not tapping into those resources to help you interpret, oh, what did it mean here? These cuneiform tablets that talk about righteousness and truth, that was all over their understanding of the kingdom, and how the kingdom had to be run by a king, a suzerain. If you don't know these things, you just think that the Bible is isolated, it's by itself, when it really isn't. It actually testifies to the historicity of how this is so real in its history, because you're comparing it with other works, and they're using the same word language as they did. And this is where we're excavating and getting sources from those necessary sources to interpret and to understand what the Bible is saying. So I'm not the type person where it's just only the scriptures, because you have to tap into other sources, history, archaeology, all of these other sources, to unpack these meanings, because we're so far removed from it. Yeah, I get it. Of course, we're going to go into dig into to scripture first, but these other sources, absolutely, we must tap into that as well. And I feel like a lot of people are not doing that, or don't want to do that, or they feel like if they do, there's something wrong with it. But that also is another hermeneutical tool, not just audience relevance. It is these other tools that are now available for us, especially in the field of archaeology.
Yeah, I put that into the argument of cultural relevance. So now they're absolutely, when we realize at the time that Moses was writing, Babylonia and Egypt were probably the most influential states at the time. To simply say that had no effect upon those people would be ridiculous. It'd even be more ridiculous to say that the people leaving Egypt after living there for a couple hundred years weren't influenced by them. That's just ridiculous to consider. So when we take a look at these things, we need to acknowledge influence, but we also to be very careful, in my opinion, because it's a slippery slope. It's very easy to start saying things like, well, in Egypt they did this, and you can see how in the Hebrews they did this. So there's a neat parallel there. I think that's what it's talking about. That can turn into a very slippery slope in that the same way today we go, well, the Catholics, they believed in this, and the Mormons believed in this, and the Protestants believed in this. They all read from the same book. They must be talking about the same thing. So it's very difficult, and that's where it's great to learn. So I put that into the same position as when we look at Apocrypha. So like the Catholic Apocrypha, when we take a look at the history books of the Maccabees, very important data. Like it really helps fill in gaps of what took place. But I wouldn't say that it's biblical canon in which we can now use that to substantiate the Hebrew claim. What we can do, though, say we go into the Babylon literature, and all of a sudden we see 50 uses of the phrase uh, grind. It slipped my mind, but like in the New Testament, we hear him say, there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, if all of a sudden we go into Babylon and find texts strewn throughout all of the history of Babylon and a constant reference to the weeping and gnashing of teeth and a talking about people suffering. Well, all of a sudden, that adds so much context to when we read the Hebrews, who seem to also be using that same cultural implication. So there's obviously cultural awareness, but my side is with a grain of salt. We must stick solely to the Hebrews for proof, but we cannot be gullible in the same breath to say we can't, that we shouldn't even, but we must examine. Like it's not really a choice. We
Mm.
must examine the surrounding cultures regardless, because they had interactions with them. Are the Hebrews reports accurate? How do we know? How do we know the Bible's accurate? There's a very interesting thing when we start interacting their claims with their nations surrounding them claims. So I wouldn't use the cultural references to override a Hebrew reference,
Oh,
but
sure.
it's extremely important to know them, be able to play them off each other. So like let's face it, the Hebrew story is the Babylon story. They both claim to come from an antediluvian world, fancy way of saying people before the flood. They both believe there's a group of people that had an empire, a great city that was led by a great man who fell, that a flood came, and then a guy on a boat transitioned through it. And then after the flood, city states were born.
Mm.
Babylon wrote this, the Hebrews wrote this. Not because they're in competition saying which one's right, but because they're agreeing with the cultural relevance of the land. They all agree that's where we came from. So that is one of those cultural references that when we bring in audience relevancy, we can't deny. That is a cultural relevancy. Two nations, which even the Bible itself claims are brothers, telling the same story. So it would actually be irresponsible to ignore their data. But when we look at it, we're not looking to see if the Bible's right or if the Bible's wrong. We're just trying to understand what the Bible is saying within itself so we understand why it's using it.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
I find that again becomes like we are talking about, that's the crux, right? Is how are we choosing to interpret our data? Which outside source are we letting sneak in? What of our own minds are we letting sneak in? What can we prove versus what can we assert? And so I think that's one of the big hurdles. And I think that's one of the hardest hurdles right now is coming up with what the covenant language is describing in Genesis versus determining through the rest of the Bible how it's being used, why it's being used, and not just duplicating the word code because it seems like it fits. I think that's where we need a good conversation.
Mm.
So identifying that, what would you say then moving forward in even further into that? Because I think we've identified a few where covenant creation, kind of why it exists. The origins, we got to re-examine origins. That's a no-brainer. We got to get away from physical creation. Covenant creation obviously is fitting the bill greatly when we just do peripheral looks at it. right now we are struggling as a collective studying this topic with the word usage and how to apply it. Is there anything else that, like, so you're new, you're coming into covenant creation, you're seeing this brouhaha about what's right, what's wrong? What is something that you'd say you would want to tell people when you're getting into covenant creation? Maybe be aware of this, or this is really good. Like, what would you say, put kind of top of mind when you're, because this is a new study for most people, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, And, when we were futurists, we moved into partial preterism, then we moved into full preterism, right? And each of those steps, we had to learn the language and the idioms, the Hebrew idioms, and the genre of the writing of the New Testament, right? Especially Matthew 24, Luke, 17, 21,
Yeah,
Mark.
Matthew 24. Yeah.
And it's very interesting to me, like when I see people going to covenant creation or just like curious and looking into it, like, what is this? And they start freaking out. I remind them the process that they had to go through to get from futurist to partial preterist and to full preterist. And that is, they had to work through all of the language there, right? And they're now understanding and even tapping into the historical pieces. Nowhere in the Bible, in the New Testament, does it say, and it was 70 AD that Jesus was talking about this. But we know this, even though it doesn't say it directly. Why? Because of the historical records, especially Josephus. So they're willing to go
Yeah,
to,
it actually played out.
yeah. And it's like, how can you deny that, right? Jesus was talking about this. How can you deny it? And they can easily go there. They can easily see, oh, I see, like, the sky had rolled up, or the dragon was there, right? Coming out of the sea. Oh, we know what that was talking about. It was talking about, the sea peoples, right? And there's no sea, that it was this. They can do all of this connection for the eschatology piece. But for some reason, when they go to Genesis, like, no, I won't do the same hermeneutical application that I did in the New Testament to figure out the end, but they won't do it in the Old Testament to figure out the beginning. I find that very comical. I really do. In a way, it's like you did it here, but you're afraid to do it there. Why? And then we have to talk about the golden calves, right? We have to talk about the idol calves that we have, of why we're still holding on to those things and why we think it's so sacred that it has to be physical, it has to be literal. When you easily understood it here in the New Testament and how things are ending, why can't you think of it that way here? And I think there's a lot of blockages of, well, this is sacred and it's in stone and it's tradition, so we can't touch it ever. And if I do, oh my gosh, God's going to throw a lightning bolt at me. And that's the thing that I see people come to, and I try to help them undo that. Like, you did that over here and it was fine. You're basically having to do that over here too. And relax, it's okay, you're not doing anything wrong, and to help people come into that same hermeneutical tool that you use here, you're using it over here. It's nothing different.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, because that is one of the scary things. For some reason, it's easier to say, well, the future is scary. But now when I take away all the bad consequences from that, there's like an easier acceptance. Like, whew, I don't have to go through all that. That's great. There's an easier acceptance. But when we look back in Genesis and go, wait a minute, this is the exact same language. Does that mean Adam wasn't the first human, or Adam didn't birth all humans? Well, that's rocky road now. That's totally different, because which is weird, because I agree with you. When we get to the new covenant concept, most people's views of the new covenant concept is now like all these people are coming in and it's growing and it's good and everything. But when we go back to Adam, and there's a covenant concept, that same thing now, it's negative and it's bad and everyone's cut off. But the language is the same, the story is the same. Jesus says the coming of the Son of Man will be the same. And we start seeing that it's all the same, but it's seen very different. We can't, like you said, we can't touch that one.
Hmm.
That has to remain, because, and I agree, those sacred cows, as you call them, we are getting to the fundamental belief structure changing now. And I will put that forward. We're not talking lightly here. These are not small topics. Covenant creation, the changing your view of origins, is just as, if not more impactful to Revelation than understanding Revelation. Because whatever you think Revelation is going on, Origins is going to change that. So when we're taking a look at that, I do get that feel. But when we go back to Genesis, we have to remain consistent. We have to stay in the same thoughts. Why? Revelation 22 ends on it. If we don't understand what's going on in one, how do we know then what's ending? And how we choose to connect those is going to be drastic. So now, if I'm going to say uh, all sin came through Adam, and Adam's the first man, and all men came from Adam, and I read Genesis as being the first human being, God's clay man, that he took some dust, spit into his hands, and formed a physical human. Well, that's going to drastically if we're okay now just on the consistent argument, that's going to drastically change the rest of the Bible, because then we get Israel is the clay in God's hands, who is the potter. So does that mean God's physically spitting on Israel, forming them? Because we have to remain consistent. And that's why, and I really like how Mercy was putting there, if it's true in the New Testament, then it has to be true in the Old Testament. Otherwise, we're just changing it to fit our ideas. And if it's the same in the Old Testament, it better be the same in Genesis. And so that I see as one of those big, it's a fear, because when we get into the origins, it's going to drastically alter the view of everything. And it's scary, because we've put more faith in a lot of ways into doctrine for security than we put in faith into God simply accepting us due to his character.
Yeah.
And so because that fear is in there, we're not willing to question some things that need to be questioned, because it just feels safer. And so I will push forward on that, realizing that it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. Galatians 5:1, it is for freedom that Christ has set you free, therefore never again yet to another yoke of slavery. What duty are you putting between you and God that won't allow you to test his word? Because that's really what this comes down to. You have a doctrine in your head. You see words that disagree with that doctrine. Now you're afraid to test it. Not because God said it, not because it's in the Bible, but because it tests what I want it to be. Now, we have to be very honest with ourselves when we're going through this. And this is the hardest part of it all, is I don't want it to mean something else, but it probably does. And I have to allow that to happen. So I think that's a really good point, Mercy, because that is probably when we get, rubber to road here, that's why we're reading it in a new way. That's why we've changed Origen's positions, because it changed the Bible to make sense. It changed the Bible to give it authority. It changed the Bible to make it understandable. And it made it so that I now I can make decisions in my life differently.
Yeah. And it's because people are on this journey to say, well, I want to just know God, right? It's going to reveal God to me. It's going to reveal God to me. And I'm telling you, everybody that's listening to this, as you go into this journey and you're unpacking Genesis, what it's going to end up doing is revealing you. It's going to reveal what's in your heart. Why do you believe? What are these belief systems that you're holding on to? Okay. And these things are going to be very uncomfortable, in a sense of like, oh my gosh. And there is this, being naked and unashamed. Will we be naked and ashamed, or will we be naked and ashamed? It's that kind of thing, having to deal with, okay, now we're asking really deep questions about, why do I believe? what do I think the Bible is really talking about? And those things feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? And that is the journey that I feel like most people that enter into this, they're already asking those questions and they're willing to go there. And those that aren't, they're just like, whatever excuse there is, they're just like, no, I can't go there, or that's all wrong, or whatever, you know? And you do see a divide in really the revealing of a person's heart through this process.
Yeah, and I think that's the real battle. And ultimately, people who are in this position at this depth of conversation, like we're all here because we're serious about it. And I think that's why it's such an impactful question. Like, what is covenant creation? Well, when preterism was first brought up, it was hated. It was looked at, oh, you're robbing the gospel. You're taking away hope. There's no point in living anymore. There's so much first reaction. And I think covenant creation has to go through that as well. We're changing origins from God was talking about building rocks, but now we're talking about God is creating a people and bringing them underneath him for some reason. Now there's a hook, there's a purpose and an interest and a need to know why. And so that drastically is going to bring you up against things that you would have never otherwise considered.
Mm.
So those who are interested and serious, that's what this is about. We want deeper, harder questions. And therefore, we're going to face deeper and harder internal issues. The
Mm.
deeper we go, the harder the sacred cows become. And that's just the way it is. It was easy to give up Matthew 24. Why? Because it just says it, right? It's just no arguing. It's like, oh, it's the end of the age. Oh, what am I going to do with that? It's just what it says. And when we accept that, everything else just starts changing. Then we go to Revelation. It just starts changing. Then we go to Genesis. It just starts changing. And that's, you know, how far and how much are you going to allow that to go? That's what it comes down to. That's what it's up to you.
Mm.
My question is, when you're going through this and you're dealing with it, are you stopping because you found an answer that really resonates, that really makes sense, that you can prove over and over and over again to many different people and have it questioned by 100 different people so that you know what you're saying is right? Or do you just like that answer? Because that's what we're up against. We all have our I just likes. The problem is that held us back in Revelation for how long? And what it held us back from was freedom. What are we holding back in ourselves by not allowing Genesis to be explored in the same exact way? It was the greatest blessing for the covenant to end. How much more of a blessing will it be to put that covenant in context with a beginning? So that would be my kind of push towards, is that honest, divergence, just let it say what it says, set our predetermined ideas to the side for a little bit. It's hard to do. We are all, biased to some degree for so many reasons. But can we get out of our own way, I think, becomes the ultimate battle for covenant creation. This new view of origins, it's picking up a lot of speed because it makes a lot of sense. And if you're honest with it, it's very rewarding when it comes to trying to just discover what is the Bible saying.
Mm.
So, Mercy, I'll give you, we got 7 minutes here just to summarize kind of thing. What would you say uh, out of one thing when it comes down to covenant creation, what has it done for you that when it comes to the Bible, comes to your real life? Because I think that's the crux, right? Like, what's the point of learning this if it's really not, what's the point? What's the point? It's not going to change anything. What has it done for you that made it worthwhile to change everything?
Mm. I think for covenant creation, there's like a bee warning sign. I hear from a lot of the full preterists that are really afraid to move into covenant creation. The number one warning that they give to people is, if you start studying that, you're going to lose your faith. You're going to get unsaved, or you're not going to believe in God. And I don't know why they're, well, I do know why they're saying that. But for me and my own experience, it's the complete opposite. If anything, my relationship with God has deepened, it's widened, it's stretched, because my relationship with God has always been here, right? And I want to know what the Bible is actually saying, not what I want it to say. There is a message in the Bible that is crying out that needs to be heard. And we know that there's been tradition, there's been institutionalized religion that has blocked that. And I'm just here to say I want to know what the Bible is saying. That is my whole reason for studying the Bible. Now, in my relationship with God, there's a deep connection there with the Bible, because without the Bible I wouldn't have really known that God is love. That was something that was revealed to me through the Bible. I knew God was powerful, strong, creator, all these things, but that God was love through the person of Jesus, that was very critical for me to know. And so in this discovery of covenant creation, or this journey, it's actually enriched my relationship. I have not lost my faith in God. I have not walked further away from him, but boy, has it made me question even more. And because of that, I'm actually drawing closer to God, not further away. So it's actually done the complete opposite for me.
Yeah, I won't change that topic at all. I think that's the perfect way to summarize it, because the more we and I think that's the truth, is at the end of the day, we want to know, well, just what does it say? I don't care if I'm right. I don't care if I'm wrong. Just what does it say? Because I kind
And
of need to know.
I think you're serious about that. Like, I really want to know what it says. There's a message. I want to know it. That's it. Bottom line, that's it. And it doesn't matter if I don't like it. Eh,
And the ultimate goal and results seem to always line up. My intention is I want to know what this is actually saying, because I know I've got filters on when I'm trying to perceive and understand the things of God in my life. Unlike other covenant creation or eschatology positions, I still think the Bible is extremely important for the points Mercy just said. There are some things that we can go day to day with our lives in relationship with God that the Bible can expose to us that we might not ever come to understand. I
what-
came to know God without the Bible, but without the Bible, I didn't come to realize my performance wasn't part of the equation. It was still a performance based relationship. And unfortunately, I was unaware. So it's through the Bible, my relationship expanded. And so, how can I take a look at just something as simple as acceptance, and then look at preterism, and then look at, or I want to know what it all says, because I know that if it's God's perfect intention, not perfect intention, just talking there, but like if it's God's intention to have relationship with us, and this image of Adam from start to finish can help get us into that relationship in a deeper, more viable way, then I want a more clearly understood reading of what he's saying. So I agree, Mercy, that if we're not benefiting in our walk with God from this, there's no point in doing it. And so I'm glad that that's your conclusion as to why covenant creation means something to you, because you and God are closer for it, not because you're smarter and you know the Bible better, which is a cool secondary event, is knowing the Bible better. But if you're not getting to know God better, you're just a Pharisee. So awesome. I really appreciate you pointing that out, because I think ultimately that is the crux behind it all. So thank you for being here, Mercy. We're coming up on it, and I think we've hit a lot of really good points. Covenant creation isn't a hard concept to get. It might be something that we're unused to. It's very unfamiliar. The idea that Genesis is not talking about physical creation, but there are other views on it, which historically there's always been other views on it, metaphorically. So when we take a look at these things, it's okay. We have the freedom to do so. If God established something in Christ, and that's why you're included in his presence, because God's good character to do so, I don't think he's going to be upset that you try to figure out what the thing says. And you're being I would rather stand before God one day completely wrong, but absolutely true in my being, saying, I just thought this was what it said. You left me with a book that was 2,000 years old. What did you expect? That's what I found out. And if I'm, cast away because of it, I'm okay with that. I'm just being true. And I think that's the ultimate functionality out of it all. This whole adventure is, can you be true? Because that's God's ultimate message anyway, is those who are true, that's who he loves. Those are who he is with. Those who live in lies, well, they have their lies to keep them company. But anyway, before we go down some preaching, I hope this clears up some ideas of covenant creation. Thank you again, Mercy, for being here. We're going to continue this conversation forward. I'm opening the door again constantly. If you have views of covenant creation, know people that do, want to come on the show, talk about it, be part of this conversation, be able to express why you think so, we'll be more than happy to bring you on. I want to thank Tyrone for doing it. It's not easy to come and sit on and have people evaluate you and tell you why you're wrong. It's part of the journey. It's part of the fun. Don't be afraid. If you do have something to say, this channel, more than happy to be wrong together. So shoot me a message, whatever it takes. For the rest of you, I really appreciate the time that you came. We made it all the way through. Next conversation, we'll just keep it going. Have a good week and all that stuff. I'm not a good channel guy. Wherever you are, hope this finds you well. God bless.